the Mac one. Okay, so the objectives for INFLUX, I'll go quickly since Thomas and others have gone through this, is to develop improved methods for quantification of urban area-wide fluxes of greenhouse gases, focusing on methane and CO2, and determining and minimizing the uncertainty in the method. So the approach is integrating multiple methods: aircraft mass balance, inverse modeling, Lagrangian plume modeling, isotope methods. We want to use tracer methods. I'll talk a little bit about that, and Hestia emissions modeling. So because Thomas and others have focused on CO2, and we've talked here before about the status of INFLUX. Just to keep it real, I'm going to just give you an update on where we are with methane. So my group has been focusing on using an aircraft mass balance method, partly to constrain the total, and that's important for methane because you come into this for methane not knowing much of anything, and the aircraft mass balance method is appealing in that it's an objective method such that you don't really need to know much about the prior emissions. So it just involves determining the difference between the downwind and the upwind integrated methane in a plume that passes through a perpendicular plane, arbitrary plane that you define. You multiply the incremental concentration by the horizontal component of the wind, and you get a flux through that plane, and then you integrate over all of the pixels in the plane, and that gives you a mass total. So here's an example flight track. This black line is the outline of the city. An important detail is there's the south side landfill on the southwest corner of the city for this particular day. The winds are like that, and so we fly back and forth from as low as we can to the top of the boundary layer with multiple transects. So this is what typical data looks like for methane. It's color-coded. These are 6 transects on this particular day, so you see a very intense plume, and if we fly upwind, you end up at the south side landfill. And so, as I'm going to say, we clip this out to estimate the total contribution of the landfill to this broader, more diffuse plume of methane from the city. So this is the interpolated data using a Kriging method, and you add up the incremental amounts relative to a background that I have to say the selection of the background is still subjective. We don't have an objective methodology that would sort of enable you to automate the process because it really depends on how the background looks given your transects. The method is pretty sensitive to the background. So for this particular case, we get 197 moles per second. We've done it many times for Indianapolis, and the mean is 135 plus or minus 58, so that's one standard deviation that includes measurement uncertainty, and it also includes variability that we don't have very well characterized, like seasonal variability. So that's data over multiple years. The other thing about the mass balance method is sometimes you get statistically unlucky that the transects don't necessarily capture the plumes. The plumes can move around, so there are some days that are particularly horrible where wherever the city plume is, you've missed it, but the assumption here is that we're downwind far enough that things are reasonably well mixed that the plume will capture the relative amounts of methane and CO2. That, of course, depends on where the landfill and where the power plant is. But if you take all of the data and do a regression, you get that line. And so the slope is 1% roughly of the CO2 flux, And so an independent way to get the total is we multiply by Kevin Gurney's Hestia estimate for CO2, which is something like 10,000 moles per second, and then you get 97 plus or minus 34. So just to remind you, the total from the sort of absolute direct mass balance method is 135. So we think that the total is sort of reasonably characterized with an uncertainty of something like 35%, about a third of the total at about 120 moles per second without seasonal detail. So I told you that we clip out the part of the transects that include the Southside landfill. That's the green data here. This is the total from multiple determinations when we felt that we were able to do that, flying upwind and attributing the plume to the landfill. And the answer is about 30% of the total, or 45 moles per second, comes from that one particular source. We've worried a lot about our ability to do that because we're clipping out the landfill from within a pretty heterogeneous, complex urban landscape. So among the things that we've been doing is CalMIM modeling of methane emissions from landfills around Indiana. Here's the Southside landfill. These are just different determinations for 5 different landfills versus the model. It looks like without oxidation in the cover material fits the data better, but the bottom line is that the Southside landfill doesn't particularly stick out as any more scatter around the line than the other sources. So we're reasonably confident in our attribution to that site. As I said, we have been wanting to include tracer techniques for Indianapolis. We've recently been doing this for landfills. So there's a landfill just upwind on the west side of Indianapolis. You have to be really careful about the incremental methane or CO2 that you're pretty darn sure what's upwind. So there's a pretty good landfill just upwind of Indianapolis, and this is a result of annual CalMIM modeling of the methane emission rates with oxidation in the cover material and without. It appears that an awful lot, most of the emission comes from the active dumping area of the landfill, and so without oxidation is probably better. The blue dots here are 2 aircraft mass balance measurements, and then the box and whisker plots are multiple tracer experiments done at that landfill. So it looks like from a single experiment, the uncertainty in the landfill or point source determinations is on the order of 30 or 40%, something like that. And that is about the fraction of the total that comes from the landfill. So where is the rest? Well, to make a long story short, with funding from NIST and also EDF, we and others, so this is from Kuldeep Prasad's poster, collaborating with Brian Lamb and others, we did lots and lots of many thousands of miles of drive-arounds characterizing plumes. And when you remove the large sources from this map, so this is just color-coded enhancement above background, it looks like that there is some diffuse methane source in Indianapolis that is responsible for the other 2/3. So we can hypothesize that that is the natural gas infrastructure, the pipeline and transmission regulating stations and so on. One way to test that is looking at the relationship between methane enhancement and propane enhancement from our aircraft flask samples. The natural gas is the dominant source of propane. The observed relationship from the pipeline people is the blue dotted line here. Our regression is there, and you can see there's a lot of scatter, but the relationship between methane and propane, leads you to the conclusion that the data is not inconsistent with the hypothesis that all the rest of the methane is coming from the natural gas infrastructure. So I want to move on to talk about the tower data from Penn State leading to some new inversion results. So again, there's 12 towers or so around the city, fewer than that of methane, but a few operating for a couple of years for methane. And so this is tower data for methane going back a couple of years. You can see the seasonal cycle. You can also see the impact of synoptic scale events on top of that seasonal cycle. And similar to what Tomas showed for CO2, if we use site number 1 as the background because this is the prevailing wind direction, you see spatial information in the average enhancement for different towers relative to the predominantly upwind tower number 1. So here's the landfill. Often this particular tower site is directly downwind of the landfill. This one isn't, but the landfill that I showed you about is somewhere up there. So there's a signal in there from a source outside of the city, and then if you get further downwind, the plume becomes more dispersed. But importantly, there's spatial information that's quite important in that tower data. So as Tomas and others, I guess Kevin showed this figure as well, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but sampling upwind and downwind, presumably the changes are impacted by sources and sinks. And using a data assimilation with the WRF Chem transport model, Bayesian inversion is conducted. So I'm going to just talk for a minute about that before I finish. So we have the Obi-Cambaliza aircraft mass balance numbers to constrain the total, and then taking out the main landfill and also a wastewater treatment plant. The rest is distributed around the natural gas distribution sector for the prior. So this is what the priors look like. This is kilotons per year of methane, and then the inversion is conducted. And this is the difference between the posterior result and the prior. It's a little bit hard to see this, but the differences are quite small compared to, the big sources are up here around 5 kilotons per year, and then the differences are down here around 0.5 to 1 or so kilotons per year. But importantly, there's an area here where there are big differences, and so there's in my view, exciting spatial content in the information from the inverse model. So if you run that for several days and look at the question of how sensitive is the posterior result in the inverse modeling for, this is 5-day emissions, based on the prior from OB and then one that is for the daytime, half that emission, and the solid lines here is the result of the inverse model. And the differences between those two are really quite small, 10% or so on average, and so it appears to be not particularly sensitive to the prior. So in conclusion, where am I in time? Pretty good. Indianapolis is a relatively well-characterized city for methane emissions, and I should emphasize relatively, but what we're getting to the point where we're getting some spatial information out of the inverse model. This is a useful test bed for method development, and there are things that, one of the reasons I say that we're looking for collaborators is that there are things that we haven't done, like tracer release for the whole urban area. There are two main sources, one landfill and the natural gas infrastructure that's probably close to 2/3 of the rest. This is going to enable better characterization of that diffuse source, and we expect that we're going to get better at this, and these are the people who have supported this work. Thank you very much.